Welcome to the UX Consultants Lounge. I'm Kyle Soucy, founder of Usable Interface, an independent UX research consultancy. You can find out more about my work and the services I offer at my website, usableinterface.com. I'll be your host here at the lounge, where I'll be providing a place for UX consultants to gather, share stories, and learn more from one another. My guest today is Becca Kennedy. She is the owner of Kennason, a consultancy combining design research and content design services. Now, I've known Becca for a while now, and I'm so glad I had an opportunity to interview her for this podcast because I just think she's wonderful, and I think more people need to know about her. And during this hour that we spent talking, we really covered a lot of topics. You're going to learn about Becca's journey transitioning from academia to becoming a UX consultant, how she found her first clients. We discussed a new service she's offering called Let's Fix It Workshops as a way to let clients get a small taste of her services before committing to a large project. We also talked a lot about when to turn down work and how it can be critical to the success of your business. And during that, we touched on how to ask about budgets, which is always hard. We spent a good chunk of time talking about subcontracting through design firms in order to supplement our pipeline whenever direct client work is slow. And lastly, we talked about disability insurance for the self-employed. So let me tell you a little bit more about Becca before getting into the interview. She's had her consultancy now for almost 10 years, and she's been working in the industry for over 15 years. Her career began in usability and human-computer interaction. Her PhD is in human factors psychology with a focus on games and simulations for training in healthcare. She started Kennason in 2015 and has since worked with over 65 organizations to help improve their products and services. Becca also writes a great newsletter called Interrobang on everyday design. She lives in Albany, New York with her spouse and cats. And when she's away from her desk, she might be walking in the woods, reading from an ever-growing stack of books, listening to a comedy podcast, or playing a silly video game, which we will actually talk a lot about in the beginning of the interview, the love of video games. So with all that said, let's get to the interview. Please enjoy Becca Kennedy. All right, Becca, well, welcome to the UX Consultants Lounge.
Thank you. I'm so excited. I wish we were in like a real cozy lounge, but given that we can't be physically together, this is, I guess, the next best thing.
Yeah, we can pretend, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Well, it's nice to have an excuse to chat with you one-on-one because I feel like we don't get a chance to do that as often as we should, or we don't make time for it as often as we should.
Yeah, it's hard. It's hard to find the time to catch up. So I'm excited to chat with you.
Yeah, I find that it's one of the perks of doing the show. It makes a point that I have to talk to people, which is good.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. You get to catch up with people, meet new people. It's pretty great.
Yeah, and another perk is that I get to do some research on you, which may have otherwise seemed creepy.
That's a good point.
What I learned is that you love to talk about theme parks, and I didn't know that.
Oh, that's hilarious. So that means I did a good job containing myself and not bringing up like theme park examples every time we talk about stuff.
Well, it was in one of your newsletters. I did read about that, where you talked about Disneyland. But what is your favorite theme park or ride?
That's an interesting question because I'm definitely a Disney theme parks person, and I'm excited that I'm planning a trip to Tokyo, which apparently has the best versions of that, where the service is excellent and the details are excellent, and it's just that level of experience that we don't really have in California or Florida anymore. But yeah, it's about, for me, appreciating all of the design and creativity and thoughtfulness that goes into designing these spaces that are just meant to be like joyful for people. Like, my whole life. I'm just like fascinated by those little things that they do to make things really a special, magical, place.
I feel embarrassed to admit it, but I've never been to Disney World.
I mean, that's normal. That's fine.
I don't know. Is it? I feel
Yeah.
like I'm always in the minority, but especially now having kids, I'm like, we probably have to bite the bullet and go. And then everybody says, even if you're not a theme park person, once you go, you become one. Like it's just the magic is there.
Yep.
Undeniable.
Yep. And I think there's like that design layer too, like just appreciating all the
Yeah.
work that goes into it in like the research too of the service design and all of that. You might have a different appreciation than someone else who's not in that
Right.
world.
Yeah, as a UX person, it's probably like a rite of passage. And I know some folks that work for Disney and I know they work really hard. So yeah, I think that should be on my list. And I also found out that your go-to recharge activity is that you like
Hmm.
playing video games.
Yep. I'm I'm a Nintendo person. Yeah, and I love playing games alone. I'm not like competitive, like let's jump online and play against people. It's an immersion thing. It's
Uh-huh.
really similar to the theme parks where it's appreciating this world that the creators built and like the mechanics in it and all that stuff. It both is something that's surface level I just enjoy, but also like on a deeper level, it's very cool how they did all of this and how they thought of it and came up with this experience for, again, like an experience that's really like for joy for people.
I was curious to know what's your favorite Nintendo game?
I am definitely a Zelda person. I'm still playing Tears of the Kingdom came out over a year ago and I'm still like jumping in and out of it because I don't want it to end. Some people are really into like battling the creatures and stuff and I'm not. I avoid them. I'd rather just like walk
Uh,
through the forest and collect things. But yeah, it's really great how those experiences can exist and people can make what they want out of it. It's really fascinating actually.
See, that makes me nostalgic because I used to play video games, but it's been way too long. It's probably been like 16 years or so. And I was really into graphic adventure
Mhm.
games like Myst or
Yeah.
Siberia. There was one called Phantasmagoria that I loved. It was like a horror adventure game.
Yeah. That's dope.
And I know what you mean by the immersive, like, I would get lost in that world, and I loved the sounds, I loved, the
Mhm.
detail, everything. It was really cool.
Yeah, a lot of video game music actually is really good to focus to, like to study to or to do some deep
Mhm.
work to. YouTube will have like rainy day, like whatever the game is, like music. And you want to do something like that instead of just a straight up soundtrack because you'll run into like boss battle music and stuff and you'll be like, why am I getting so anxious all of a sudden?
I have to look that up because I always loved the music from Siberia. That was my ultimate favorite, so I gotta look
Oh,
that
I
up.
gotta look it up too now.
Oh, it's good. It's so good. It's kinda cool to do this research because I already knew from years of knowing you that you were just laid back and easy to be around, easy to talk to, but I just had no idea how playful you
That's
are.
funny. Yeah, I think that's accurate.
Well, let's talk now about your business, Kennason. So tell us a little bit about it and the services you offer.
Okay, sure. So my consulting company is called Kennason, and it is just me, although I'll bring in people here and there where it makes sense. So Kennason offers user experience strategy. And my specific flavors of that, I usually say are design research or UX research and content design. That being said, I do a lot of different things. It becomes hard to specialize when it's just like, I don't know, just wanting to do so much and wanting to do so many different things. But I think where my skills are and where I can offer the most is really the research piece. And then if there's a content component, like the content piece, whether that's information architecture or just organizing, structuring information, UX writing, I kind of put all those things together. And I've been doing that since 2015. So I started the company in 2015, been almost 10 years, and I'm still going. So that's a good thing.
Oh, that's great. So you're gonna celebrate your 10th anniversary soon.
Yeah. Actually, it's in like a year, but I'm starting to round up. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Basically a decade
Yeah.
at this point. Can I start saying that in my own copy?
Yes. Yeah. I think you can. It's earned. And so 2015, and if I remember correctly, did it originally start solo or did you start as a partnership?
Yes, that's such a good and interesting and funny question. So I started it with two other people. which I think was the right move for me at the time. So at that point, I was fairly young and I didn't really know what a consulting company or freelance business would look like at all. So when I told a couple friends of mine that I wanted to do it, I had, two different friends be like, cool, I want to do it with you. And I was like, great, I need help. That's fine. So our first few clients, we tackled as a team. And I think fairly quickly, it was kind of obvious that I was the one who was just like more into it and like, oh, I want this to be like my life. Like, this is what I want to do with my career. It's less about like, oh, let's do like a little side hustle and move on. And I think the other folks went on to do other really cool things. But yeah, so the name Kennason actually is a remnant of multiple last names because my last name's Kennedy, which occasionally causes confusion with people calling me by the wrong last name.
Oh,
But
yeah.
that's fine. I like that it was a name that didn't specifically reference user experience or tech or anything that I would feel could pigeonhole me in the future. So that's why I've stuck with that.
That brings up such a good point. We actually had a listener question, and it was all about, is it better to use your own name or a business name when you're naming your business? And I think it's funny that you mentioned how you didn't want to be stuck if you were to name it something other than your name. I kind of had the same issue when I was naming my business where 20 years ago, I didn't know really what I wanted to specialize in. I did a little wireframing, did a little research, did a little this, did a little that. So it was just usable interface. I'm like, that kind of covers
Right.
it all. But now, now that I strictly do research, I wish it was more descriptive because it literally could, like you read that, it could be copy, it could be design, it could be development. I mean, anything goes into a usable interface. So if I could do it over again, I might have chosen differently, but I don't know if I would have done my name or not.
Yeah.
So Kenasson is Kennedy U, and then there were two others, and part of that is the
Yeah.
name, or
Exactly.
okay,
It's actually one of their last names. It was kind of a funny beginning to it. But I never think about that because I'm just like, at this point, people know that as the name of the company. Like, SEO's good, websites there, emails there. This works out. People don't really question it.
yeah.
You don't have to say what it is, but have you thought about like if you would change your name, what it might be instead?
No, I haven't. I haven't given it that much thought where I would have an alternative. But if I could do it over again, I probably wouldn't have gone as
Yeah.
broad. I know people who have their, last name consulting or whatever, and it works fine. I don't know why I went that route. I think I've always wished that I could say the name and people would be like, oh, okay, I pretty much get what
Hmm.
you do. But I don't know if that's even possible
Yeah.
anymore. Because there's so much nuance to all the services everyone provides.
Yeah.
So with your name, I'm curious, at what point in the business did the other two kind of drop off and you become just solo?
I don't know if I remember exactly. I think the first person, and she ended up taking on a full-time role as a UX designer in-house somewhere and kind of moved on. And I think that happened like within maybe a year or so. But she did help get everything just kind of set up. And I had not really worked in an agency setting before or an industry setting before. So even just knowing Trello, Slack, like just some of like the tools and processes that make for a successful project, like she introduced to me. So at least I was walking into client projects having that sort of thing set up. Whereas otherwise I wouldn't, like if I were on my own, I honestly did not know that information. And then the other partner, he was around for a few years also. And there were a few projects we did together, but ultimately he's more of a like, I want to build a product person and I'm more of a, I want to deliver services person. I'm not interested in like building my
Mhm.
own thing or having a startup. So I think that's why ultimately he ended up wanting to do other things. And so it's been mostly me for the duration of the business, but exclusively me for the last 5, 6 years, maybe.
Okay. And when you originally started, is it the same services you're doing now, that mixture of UX research and content development or
Yeah.
content
So
design?
at the time, it was actually a lot more usability focused. That's more what my skills were because actually I came from academia. So usability research was closer to what I had already done. And it took me a few years to just kind of build up some more I think, specific skills with discovery research, like concept testing, like more innovation type stuff. And the content design stuff actually came a little bit later, the past maybe 3 or 4 years, where I really enjoy doing, I'll simplify and say, like, the words for
Mhm.
projects. And that would be what I would end up doing a lot of times on projects, is filling in and being that person. So I made an effort to go to content design conferences and read the books and just kind of fine tune how I thought about that and how I offered that and how I executed on the content piece, because I find it actually meshes very well with the research side of things. Like, how do we change our messaging, for example, or is our terminology working, or like we need an audit of what content exists. That works really well with, like, well, let's do some research and figure it out. Let's talk to people. Let's use the words they use. Let's, do some navigation testing or card sorting or whatever it might be. They just kind of naturally fit together really well.
Yeah, it's a great mix to have a researcher that also does content. I think that's great. And with your background, I'm often asked questions from people that are in academia, like, how do you transition? And it's definitely not a world I know because I do not have a PhD at all. I know that you do. You have a PhD in human factors psychology. And I'd love to know what that journey was from earning your PhD to becoming a UX consultant.
Yeah. So for me, and you and I have actually chatted about this before, where like the way people get into UX research and consulting really can depend on just where and when you were, when you kind of like figured it out, made that connection and like went for it. So for me, I went to grad school for human factors psychology, like you said. So if anyone listening isn't sure what that is, basically it's the study of how people interact with technology and interact with systems. And a lot of the focus with that kind of research is reducing human error. So a lot of times it's very safety critical contexts. Traditionally, it was a lot of military stuff. I was doing healthcare related stuff. But the reason I chose that is because, to your point earlier about video games, a lot of the research that's done in human factors actually is related to training and is related to using video games and simulations and virtual environments, virtual reality for training purposes. So when I started grad school, that was 2009. So that was also a good time to go to grad school anyway, because it was recession time. You were already a working gal at the time. But for me, it kind of worked out that like I had the PhD idea in my head while I was in college. So I did have research experience and stuff that luckily did enable me to get accepted to a grad program and go for human factors.
Nice.
I'm from Albany, New York. I went to college also in New York. I moved to Norfolk, Virginia for grad school. And after I got through like coursework and qualifying exams, which are a really big deal in PhD programs, I actually ended up moving back to Albany. So my personal life, just everything kind of led me to need more just like a safer place to anchor and just like restart, be somewhere where I wanted to live, be near people, I was close to, and kind of get my footing and start my kind of professional life. So I was still working on my dissertation at the time, but kind of like part-time, and it took a while. But my first job when I moved back to Albany, which was kind of a natural fit, was working at a university as a research staff member in a healthcare lab. So it was more of what I had been doing in grad school. I didn't get paid a ton. It was not a high profile position at all. But the purpose of that was to start making some money and really just start like getting to know what was happening in Albany. So while I had been becoming an expert basically in human factors, I was realizing that user experience is really similar and more what I was going for when I went to grad school. I kind of thought it would be a little bit more, instead of like only like just safety critical task based stuff. I wanted to do more like everyday products and improving things for people and making things better for people and some of that. So I was kind of learning about user experience at the same time. So when I landed in Albany, I was like, this is my chance. This is who I am. I'm a UX researcher is how I'm rebranding. and going to meetups and kind of like finding other people who are doing similar things, eventually starting Kennason, leaving the academic job and kind of going forward from there. So a lot of trial and error along the way. But again, related to that time period, it was 2014, 2015. So like that was a perfect time to kind of jump into UX. It was becoming
Yes.
recognized and becoming valued in the tech industry, but it wasn't like overflowing, flooded with people. There weren't a lot of folks who were like actually skilled and could do that kind of work yet. So there were a lot of UX designers, I will say, but the researchers hadn't caught up yet. So it was actually a great time to kind of figure it out, transfer those kind of academic research skills to more what I wanted to do and kind of make it happen.
That's perfect. And it was a perfect time for that. And you mentioned earlier that you had the two partners
Mhm.
and you had your first clients. How did you find some of those first clients? Was it the local networking in Albany
That's
or?
exactly right. So again, at that time, there was less remote work happening. Not that it didn't exist, but it just, I didn't know it existed yet. So definitely, yeah, I was going to a ton of like tech and design and even UX meetups in Albany. So that's how I was getting to know people. Our first clients were startups. So there at the time was a pretty thriving startup community, partly because of the universities here and stuff. So our first projects were with clients who had very little budget, but that was okay at the time. For me, just to get paid at all to kind of like do what I wanted to do felt like a gift, honestly. And it was kind of quick and dirty research studies with them. And I would say from there, there were what I think of now as like a few turning points. So I think three separate, just kind of turning points that led to like, all right, this is a success. So going from the startup clients to my first state government contract, like a single project that was something like, $27,000, which was more than I made for my salary as a grad student, one project. It just felt like, oh, wow, like this is amazing. And that came from, connections in the community where there was usability tested needed for like a new feature that one of the state websites was launching, and I was the one to do it. Like, that was amazing. The second turning point was one of my connections locally turned into like two other projects with like locally known companies. So in that instance, it was recognizing that there was somebody who understood exactly what value I bring, even before I was really good at articulating it.
Mhm.
He, like, understood, oh, here's what you do. Like, I'm involved, I'm on the board or whatever for two companies who really need that right now. So that helped kind of build things up. And then the third turning point was understanding and finding the opportunities to do subcontracting remotely. So I had done a little bit of
Yeah.
subcontracting with like a local web dev shop, but to recognize that there are agencies everywhere, and a lot of them are kind of working remotely, even at the time, which was, pre-COVID, that there are opportunities to work on bigger projects with nationally or internationally known companies and work with a team on bigger efforts was humongous for me. And just figuring out those missing pieces of this is how you turn it from I can make a living doing this to like, oh, I can do well running a business, more so than kind of
Yeah.
like freelancing. So that shift from freelancing, to like, I'm a consultant now.
I feel like you did a great job marketing yourself locally and not even marketing yourself, just being active, right, in the community, which at that time for me, 2009, I was very active in local groups. If I wasn't part of a group, I was starting a group. And I think that was so key to helping me too get business. And ever since the pandemic, I just feel so sorry for people that are trying to get that first client, get their business up and going, because I know I depended on that a lot. And I always thought of you when we first met, I just thought of you. I'm like, okay, she's the Albany girl. Like
Yeah.
she's talking everywhere. Like you just kind of had your finger on the pulse of everything happening there. And I thought that was so smart and good to do. I know we talked before just recently about doing something like joining your local chamber of commerce. And I have not done it, but I've gotten the recommendation to do it. And my area is, where I live is pretty rural. And it's not like I can't imagine that somebody is going to need user research or usability testing services in this area and be like, you're the person. And I believe you had a similar experience, right?
I did. So I had some good experiences with my city chamber of commerce. For example, like that state usability testing contract I mentioned. I was
Uh-huh.
able to use the chamber of commerce office as like because I don't have like a actual office. Like I work from home. I don't have an actual office to bring people
Yeah.
in, but I had a spot there that I just kind of like borrowed for a week to do in-person usability testing. Um,
Oh, that's
Right?
nice.
So when we used to
Yeah.
do that a lot more often than we do now, that
Right.
was a benefit, for example. But I struggled a bit. I will say like that subcontracting aha moment came not from the Chamber of Commerce. It was just something that I don't think I was a good fit for what everyone else is doing there. Like it was a lot of people doing really great things, but it was more about like, oh, I'm opening a store, I'm opening a bakery, I'm like doing these other types of small businesses that weren't really service-based businesses.
Hmm.
So where
Yep.
I hope to get like a little bit of education there in terms of entrepreneurship, it didn't quite align with the ever-changing world of consulting in tech, right? So like no one ever kind of
Right.
suggested like, "Oh, why don't you think about joining projects that big agencies are doing?" Like never occurred to me, didn't occur to them. So just as an example of just not having a ton in common with the folks there, and
Hmm.
just kind of finding my communities elsewhere, like on Slack and stuff like that.
I'm thinking of giving it a shot because who knows, right? Like I'm saying probably not, but maybe it's worth it just 1 year, pay the dues and see what the Chamber of Commerce has. Like maybe it does have something
Mhm.
like even that perk of the office space that could be cool or just meeting someone. You never know. And I'm so desperate to get back out there to be socializing in groups again in person that I don't know, I might give it a whirl. I might give it a whirl. But you also mentioned too, about when you're first starting, articulating what you do and getting that elevator pitch down. That was so hard for me. It took a long time to get comfortable with presenting myself and just being able to clearly state what it is I do. Because I know at that time too, UX was such a mystery. Like nobody knew what the heck you were talking about. But I struggled with that too. I don't know why that took so long for me, but it was nice when I could finally be like confident about
Yeah.
explaining my services.
I think a lot of the difficulty I was running into early on and why I didn't have a lot of confidence early on is I was just talking to the wrong people. You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
if it's not something that's relevant to them, it's not really going to connect so much. And that's okay. And at this point, I've also learned like different ways of explaining what I do based on what the other person does. For example, the examples you give when you talk about what you do or the kinds of projects or clients you've had can depend on whatever they do and whatever might resonate with them. But that all kind of takes time to figure out.
Yeah. Yeah. I just try to make it relatable.
Yeah, exactly.
You also made a point to mention the difference between labeling yourself as a freelancer or a consultant. And that actually hits on another listener question we had, which was how do you decide whether to call yourself consultant or freelancer?
Man, I think we've definitely talked about this before.
Oh, yeah. Oh, ton.
Still kind of use both, again, depending on the context, but I think there is a difference in how people perceive you. So I think of a freelancer as kind of an extra pair of hands. So that comes up a lot. I mean, especially like in subcontracting, for example, where, it might be like, oh, we're running this bigger project and we need someone to come in and run 2 sets of 10 interviews or whatever, and, like, you don't necessarily have a say in how it's done or and maybe you don't want to, you just wanna, like, do whatever's already been planned, just execute on it, and there's nothing wrong with that at all, but I think consulting is more about having a point of view, um, and coming in as a collaborator, so that is something that I tell people in early conversations if I'm talking to prospects is that I work as more of a consultant than a freelancer. So that means you really get a thought partner if you bring me in. Like, I do want to collaborate. I want to hear where you're coming from, what you've already done, what your priorities are. And I can kind of adapt and like figure out what makes sense, what's most efficient, what'll help you get the answers you need and help you look good. Like, I want to come in and be that helper in a way that's like very productive. And comes from a place of expertise. So not to say freelancers aren't that, but I think there can be a perception difference in how people think about you based on how you describe yourself.
Yeah. And when we had this discussion, you were the very first person that I talked to. I'm like, I'm thinking of doing this podcast. I don't know if it's crazy. And you were awesome about supporting me and encouraging me to do it. And at that time, I was like, I think it's going to be Freelancers Lounge. Yeah, I think that's what it's going to be. And it's bounced back and forth so much. And then I ended up doing consultants for pretty much the reason that you mentioned. It's that difference between offering the strategy versus just doing staff augmentation work, which, like you said, is still good and still needed, but there's just a difference there. But I've often said, call me either, whatever. But there is a difference.
There definitely
Yeah.
is. I think I'm also called a contractor sometimes. That's okay. That's fine. That won't be how I introduce myself. But internally,
Right.
that might be how they classify me, and that's fine.
See, contractor for me is hard. Oh my gosh. I kind of get a little like my back gets a little straight and like, I'm not a contractor.
Yeah, like, how dare
Because-
you? Because usually it's usually full time.
Yeah. Right. It's a 40-hour a week W-2 contract. That's where I want to make the distinction.
Oh,
you know?
definitely. Yeah, that's important
Yeah.
to say. I
Yeah.
also always say that too. Like, I think in my earliest conversations with prospects, I say, well, I'm usually working on more than one thing at a time. So I don't, work with one individual client or project 100%. Like, that's just not really how I work. Important to kind of like set up
Yeah.
that expectation up front.
Yeah, that boundary, that expectation. Absolutely. Yeah. Well, one thing I wanted to talk about was a service that you recently added on your website called Let's Fix It Workshops. And I was wondering if you could tell us more about them.
I would love to. Yeah. So I started offering those maybe a little over a year ago. And it was just a realization I had that, like, I think there was something missing in how I was offering my services. So the Let's Fix It workshop, what they are is really focused work sessions with clients. I would say really it's aimed at new to me clients. So it's like a focused working session to collaborate on a specific issue they might be having. So UX issue, we know we need to do research, but we don't even know where to start. So it's really thinking of that like step 0 that I know a lot of organizations are in when it comes to like not even knowing where to go or what to do or what to ask for from a consultant. So I frame it 3 ways. Let's fix research, let's fix content, and let's fix usability. And they're meant to be contained. Tactical problem solving. So I called it Let's Fix It because it's collaborative. Like, hey, let's do it. And let's fix it, meaning like, let's come up with some stuff that you can kind of do right away to smooth things out for the users of your product or service. So it's about efficiency. I really want people to walk away from that with things they can do, fixes they can make immediately, but with an eye toward longer term strategy, like what they might do if they were to continue working with me, for example. So yeah, for me, I thought I'd had so many conversations with clients that, or potential clients that never really went anywhere because it would take a really long time, a lot of back and forth to even figure out what they needed or how we could structure an engagement. So this is a way of taking that discovery piece, which you can build into a larger project if that works for you. But I separated it out because I think, even if that's all a client does, it's a low financial commitment for them. It's a low time, effort commitment for me. And at least they have that starting point. And if they decide to work with me, awesome. If not, we can both be at least happy with what we have done with that.
And I think that's an interesting framing of it because it's not just scoping, but it's also letting them walk away with some actionable takeaways.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. And how long are the sessions for this?
I aim to do about 2 hours. I've done 90 minutes, just depending on the context, but it really is there's some pre-work involved, so I will have, like, a couple calls and just get some context and ask participants, and I like to keep it small too, so I like, 5 people's great. Like, whoever those, like, key stakeholders are, I'll send out a form beforehand that asks individuals their own perspectives on things, if that
Mhm.
makes sense, and then kind of, like, discuss it in aggregate in a workshop that we do together, and we do some, like, sticky note stuff or whatever just to kind of prioritize issues. I had one organization participate who they knew they had it was like an upcoming conference or meeting, I forget exactly what it was, but basically they knew they were going to have a bunch of their users together at an upcoming in-person event, and they wanted to have a survey ready with a QR code and like announce it and stuff. And that whole workshop was about narrowing down everything they thought they wanted to learn from a single survey into what makes most sense for you to keep it simple, match the context, have people actually like finish answering it, and give you something that's usable information for whatever the exact next thing is.
And how have the Let's Fix It workshops been with getting new projects or even getting people to retain your services for other things?
I would love to do more of it, but I will say so far it has been helpful in just getting people through the door. So where a
Yeah. Yeah.
conversation might have just not really gone anywhere because maybe we couldn't figure out a way to set up a bigger project to help them, or they weren't really totally bought in, or couldn't get whoever manages the money to buy in. It's just an easier, again, like lower stakes way of like getting a new client, and hopefully leading to more. But sometimes that's kind of a longer term play. So we'll see how it keeps going. It's been an experiment, but I am happy with it because I also enjoy doing it. Fun to learn new things and really kind of problem solve in that way.
Well, I think it's brilliant. From a business perspective, I learned about it when you posted on LinkedIn. You said, "Hey, I've got these Let's Fix It workshops," and I was like, "Oh, what a smart way to package this up to take a smaller bite if someone's not ready for a meal,
Yes.
and to get an engagement started with you." So I thought that was great.
I love that small bite metaphor because that's exactly right.
Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing that because I think that's helpful. That might help some others too that are thinking of doing something like that, a smaller engagement to get people
Yeah.
through the door.
I think
Yeah.
it's often hard for researchers specifically to kind of like package our stuff. I've seen designers do it well. For example, like it can work really well for people to have a set, like, here's how I do things for this set price. This is what you get. With research, it's so hard because every context is totally different. And that's what I
Yeah.
always say too with client work. For me, it's not cookie cutter. It's not one size fits all. It's about what methods work, for your particular problem areas, your specific research questions, your budget, like all of that is just so
Mhm.
different. Or what research have you already done? Where are you starting with this? Like, there's a lot that goes into scoping and pricing a project. So to try to create packages for most of it doesn't really work. But I think, yes, for this initial like discovery, small bite, let's work something out that you might be dealing with, that seems like it works pretty well.
And it's a good segue to the other thing I wanted to talk to you about, which is how you choose to take on projects or say no to projects. Because you wrote a great article for Smashing Magazine a few years ago about when to say no. And I really loved in your article, you put it so beautifully where you said saying no at the right times can be just as critical to the success of your business as saying yes. So could you share some of your top tips with us for when it's appropriate or probably best to say no?
Yes, and I have to say, I know it's so hard to say no to stuff sometimes because, I mean, first of all, like, we have to make a living. We have to, keep the lights on. Sometimes you need work, and that kind of shifts things to where you might say no to things that aren't great, but you got to just do it to connect the dots to the next thing. But I learned, and I'm sure you've experienced and other consultants have experienced, that if you say yes to something that you don't feel great about, you'll resent it. Like, And that could be because it's just not a fit for your skills. Early on, I would have people asking me to do UX design work. And I'm like, I'm not really a good designer. You don't really want me to do that. And I could have said yes to those things and just been like, well, here you go. It's okay-ish, but that doesn't make sense. But that could also apply to like a research project that's maybe usability testing and you don't do usability tests. Like technically you could figure it out, but if it's something you don't even want to do, like maybe just offer it to somebody else who would be a better fit. It could also just not be a good fit for your schedule. So when we're in the feast era of our feast or famine, ever ongoing cycle, sometimes we want to say yes to things because it's just like, oh, this seems really cool. Even though my plate's already full, I can make it work. That's a future me problem. And, that can be really hard to say no or to, pass it along to a friend or whatever. But ultimately, I would never want to be in a situation where I do a bad job on a project because I've just stretched myself too thin or have to rush or just make like awful mistakes or something. That's just not worth it. So that's another piece of it. And also, if the budget of the project is not good, like sometimes those are the easiest ones to say no to, but sometimes not. If you're like, oh, this does seem like interesting and I want to help them, but they would be paying me like a quarter of my usual rate, you would quickly start to resent things that otherwise you wouldn't. Like every new email would be like, what do you want now? Aren't I done with this?
Yeah, the resentment would be there.
So yeah, I personally have a checklist that I created. So when I am considering projects, I will take a look at that and be like, all right, I like a hell yeah is like if 7 or more of these things are true. A probably yes is if like 5 or more are true. And if it's less than that, don't take it unless like I really need it kind of stuff. So, I mean, everyone's checklist could be different, but for me, it is like, is it in an industry I enjoy? Like for me, that's entertainment, gaming, wellness, or stuff I would feel good about, like sustainability stuff. Does it pay a rate that would be equivalent to an hourly rate that's what I want to get? Is it with people I enjoy working with? Because that plays like a huge role.
Yeah.
So stuff like that when I'm considering opportunities, because I'm sure a lot of other people do, but like I get really excited about like new possibilities and like I want to say yes right away. But if you take a beat, take a night, think about it, like sometimes you'll realize, all right, that could be cool, but it's not ideal. So I will pass on that.
I love that you have a checklist, an actual checklist, because I don't, and I think sometimes without having that listed out in front of you and literally checking them off, counting them up, is it really worth it? Because sometimes you just get excited about the idea of something and you forget about, oh, well, it's not really working out in these areas. And
Mhm.
I think that that's helpful. And you mentioned the project schedule. I I find that a lot of people don't realize that they can't book themselves really 40 hours a week with client
No.
work. You have to leave time in your week for business development and outreach, or else you are going to have a dip. You're going to have a slow period, right? You can't always only be doing development and outreach when you're slow.
Mhm.
So you got to build that into your week. So I think that's a great point. I do have a question about budget, because this is something that is something we always face, and it's so hard. You need to know the budget, right, in order to scope appropriately, to propose something that's within it. But it's oftentimes very hard to get the budget from the prospective client. How do you go about this? Do you have any tips for how to get them to share the budget with you?
Yeah, it's always you get better and better at it the more you practice, of course. I think sometimes asking like, is there an amount that's been approved for this budget that I should know about? That does 2 things. That asks, is there an
Mhm.
amount? Is there a budget? And has it been approved? Because you want that information. And maybe the person you're talking to hasn't even necessarily done their homework yet, and they don't know where the money would be coming from, and they want your proposal first and ask for the money basically. But you kind of want to avoid that situation if you can. So that's a question that works out okay. Often they'll say, well, we want to see what you come up with, you know? we don't know how much it costs. Let us know. And that usually doesn't go the best either, because usually the number they have in mind is lower than whatever you give. But in those
That's the answer I loathe. I cannot stand that answer, but you get it all the time.
exactly. But one thing I'll do, if I really can't get any kind of numbers from them in conversation, I'll put together a proposal that has 3 different options. And the most appealing one, the one that I am actually recommending, is going to be the highest one, but I'll be like, all right, but if your budget's less than this, here's what we would cut out of everything we talked about. If you want it even less, like you get a very like bare bones version of that might work for you. That's okay. But I think seeing the options can help too, to understand like what they're actually getting for the money, right? I also really hate when this has happened a few times where you give your project fee and then they come back and say, how much is that an hour? Because that's really what you want to avoid, is that like trading time for money transactional thing. And a lot of times that's the way the client's thinking about it, but that really does not serve us,
Right. Right.
So, and even
What do you say in response?
I really try not to give a number. I really try to say that like the price is based on the effort and the value, and I work very quickly. So just that kind of stuff. And sometimes that works. Sometimes they really just need a number, especially actually if you're subcontracting through an agency and that's how they bill their client is hourly. It's like, well, you can't necessarily get around that. So I'll try to give the high end of my hourly rate, right? Like I'm not trying to cut you a deal or something. That's how much it costs. If we're doing this hourly, if I'm tracking my time, that's how much it's going to cost.
To the budget or the question that you ask, I think that's pretty brilliant. So asking them, is there a budget and has it been approved? I love that, because who wants to admit that they're working without a budget, that they don't have a budget? Nobody does, right? I'm actually going to use that. I have never thought to say that second line of has it been approved. I think that's great, because typically I'm just asking, what's your budget? And then I get that response of like, oh, well, we don't really, we just want to see what you come up with, and don't be held back by that. And it's like, no, I need to know, because you're immediately going to come back with sticker shock, and then I'm finally going to get an idea of your range. So let's skip that and get right to it. I'm going to put a link to the article in the show notes for everyone, because you had a really great example of how you decline work nicely but assertively, which I thought was really nice. So I'm going to put that in the show notes for people to look at, because I do have a hard time saying no. And I find it helpful just to have almost like a template for how to do it in a way that doesn't leave them high and dry, still gives them a feeling that you're helping, but you're just not taking on the work. So I thought that was well done.
It's, that's can be hard to do. Sometimes you think you're clear and you're not. But I think saying, thank you so much for the opportunity. This isn't going to work right now. This is not a fit for the type of work I'm trying to do right now, or my schedule or whatever, is great. And then I like to, if it makes sense, just like offer like, but I can share the opportunity with others who might be a better fit if you want help doing that. Or if truly it's like a scheduling issue, just say, unfortunately, I'm booked up right now, but I would love to work on this with you in the future. So if things change in your timeline, or if something else comes up, please reach out. Like being clear about what the next steps are, I think is good too. People don't get upset usually. I had like one person be like, I've never had anybody in all my years say no to a meeting. And I was just like, all right.
Really?
Yeah. I just
Wow.
I just knew the product was not a fit for something I wanted to do. And I was very polite and clear and didn't drag them along. And I was just like, no, thank you. It's like never in all my years of business have I had someone say no to a meeting. I was like, well, that's too bad.
Good for you. That's surprising.
Like, it seemed fun.
Well, yeah, right. That interaction tells you a lot that you did the right thing, turning it down. Wow. You never know what you're going to come up against. Right?
Yeah. But overall, like, people are just people. They just want to know so they can make their next decision.
Yeah. And you mentioned a couple times now about subcontracting. And I know, over the years, we've talked with each other a lot about subcontracting through larger design firms. And we do this in order to supplement our pipeline whenever direct client work is slow. And I just like to discuss that a little more deeper now for our listeners. And let me start, I guess, by defining subcontracting. And let me know if you agree with this. So, with subcontracting through a larger design firm, you still have control over when and how you work. You create your own schedule, they work around it. But the number of hours and or the scope of the work is really defined by that larger firm. And if you're in the US, you would still be considered 1099. This is not a W-2 contract where you're committing to be on site or even at someone else's disposal during a set schedule. Becca, would you agree with this definition?
Yep. I think that's exactly right. Yeah.
And what are the key benefits and drawbacks of subcontracting through a larger design firm for you?
Yeah, it's interesting as you were explaining that. I'm like, it really is like having two clients at once. Like the agency is your
Yeah.
client and the end client is your client and you're kind of delivering to both. So benefits, I mean, like you said, it's great to fill in gaps and kind of supplement stuff we're doing when those opportunities come along. I actually think a big benefit for me is working with a team. So although like I'm kind of a independent person by heart, like across my life, I like my alone time and I like doing my own thing. I also like people. But the opportunity to work with a team of people on a project, if they're good people to work with, is amazing. To be like jam on stuff together and come up with ideas
Yeah.
and get feedback on your piece and get feedback on their piece. So a lot of times subcontracting for me, like a project team might be like a project manager, like a designer, maybe a writer, maybe a business designer. So you all come with your own expertise and you can actually work together on stuff. Sometimes you're the only one subcontracting, so they're like an existing dynamic that you're jumping into. Sometimes everyone's a consultant, and that's great too. But I actually really like that aspect of it, of working as a team and working toward those deliverables together. It's almost like the feeling I got in high school of just like, oh, like we're all putting on this musical and we're moving toward like opening night, and just that kind of energy can be cool as long as it's not stressful. So I think that's a benefit, like also just working and learning from other people. And then maybe what's more obvious as a benefit is not having to deal with all of the getting the project and all the client facing stuff, um, all those back and forth emails. Like usually that's not on your plate. You're just doing your expert piece of the engagement, right?
Right.
Is that how you usually
Yeah.
experience it too?
Yeah. So you don't own that client relationship, they do. And in some ways, it's kind of like a bummer because I'm not quote unquote growing my business because I'm not adding that client to my client list. But I mean, you have to look at growth. Like we gain so much experience, all the projects that we do, and sometimes they work on some really great brands, some great juicy stuff that we may have not be able to get on our own,
Mhm.
or not be able to work with such a great team on, like you mentioned. So I agree that that's a definite benefit as well. Downside can sometimes be like you mentioned, a lot of them are time and materials. It's hourly. It's rare that I'm able to go in fixed project. That's definitely what I prefer. So that can be it can feel a little bit like a grind because it's usually a little chaotic. Sometimes agency work, you're just doing a lot of, I always use the analogy of just like running with scissors in your hands. And that's not always the case, but it's always a tight time frame, it feels like, and juggling other things along with it. So in that way, it can sometimes be hard. But I was curious, how do you balance your own client work with projects along with some of the subcontracting work that you're doing? How do you make sure neither one gets neglected?
That is so tricky, actually, because although, like we've chatted about, it's not that we go into a subcontract saying, like, I'm available for you 40 hours a week, like, I'm your temporary employee. Like, that's not how that should be. And if that's what they want,
Yeah.
I would probably not want to take that project. Um,
Tell them to get a contractor, right? Yeah.
yeah, exactly. Um, I think as much as like with the agency or firm you're working with, like getting things on the calendar is so important. And some agencies are so good about this anyway. Like if you're expected to be at daily stand-ups, by the way, I love when they're like, we have daily stand-ups, come to the ones you can come to. If not, that's okay. Because it recognizes that, like, all right, you're not like literally here every second.
Right.
But like, get those on the calendar. If you are running research, like running interviews or testing sessions, like getting those days on the calendar is super important, because usually with subcontracting, it's like, here's the weeks we have set aside. We're going to have the client listening in or whatever. It's just more, you don't have so much control over spreading them out like I like to do or stuff like that. But blocking those days off is great, because I won't really schedule other stuff on research heavy weeks because I know I'm going to be tired. I know I'm going to be like committed to this one priority for a few days. So that really helps a lot. But I think it also can be easy to get into that flow and like going through the motions with your subcontract, because it does feel a little bit more like a job with, coworkers and stuff. But you're right. You have to remember that, like, all right, I have to keep going with my stuff too. I have to keep having my meetings with potential clients. I have to not let my client work fall behind, because then we're in a bad spot if, we don't have our own clients to go back to once this engagement's over. So I have learned that the hard way in the past, where I just got too comfortable subcontracting, like serial subcontracting, right? So like project after project.
Mm-hmm.
And when that dried up, I realized, oh no, like I actually don't have other stuff at the moment. So it happens, it is really hard.
Yeah. Like subcontracting, I'm so grateful for it. And I never want to feel like I'm annoyed by it or anything like that, because it's what keeps the pipeline full a lot of times. When client work is dry, which it can be, I've never been one of those people that can be booked back to back year after year. Like, there's going to be slow periods. And it's nice to have relationships, partnerships with agencies that can, hopefully stars align and we can work together from time to time and keep that going. But at the same time, I will admit, when you look back at your year and it's more subcontracting than direct client work, for me personally, I'm kind of like, oh,
Yeah.
I want more direct client work than subcontracting. But it's like, at the same time, I almost don't even want to say that out loud, because I would never want the subcontracting to completely go away either.
It's an okay balance. I probably end up doing about 50-50. And of course, we've talked about this, but like last year, 2023, was like the worst. For me, it was like my worst business year. It was so hard.
Right there with you. Yep.
So, I mean, having some, like, I made more connections with more agencies than I had before, because I was just like, well, this is great. They still have some work coming in. And by the way, like marketing agencies. So when we were seeing a lot of, tech layoffs and UX people getting laid off and content people getting laid off, the marketing folks are still going. So I started doing a little bit more like marketing related research, subcontracting, where it's really like, I don't think about it much differently, but the money comes from the marketing departments and the marketing agencies, right? So just a side note, that's something that ended up working out for me to kind of get through a slower time.
Oh, that's interesting. And it is market research, UX research. There are so many transferable skills there. We are going after different information, but it's still super interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yep.
So I'd like to jump to a completely different topic now that seems so random, but I think it's needed. A while ago, you had mentioned to me shopping around for disability insurance. And at the time, I thought that was so wise. As a self-employed person, we all should have this coverage, and I'm super embarrassed to admit that I still don't have it, which is crazy. I have 2 kids. I am 20 years in business. Why don't I have disability insurance? We'll discuss, but I'm hoping that this discussion will serve as a good reminder to myself and to the listeners to make sure you have coverage. So if you could fill us in just on your insurance shopping experience and just tell us what you ended up getting.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm kind of a nerd about like finance stuff. And I think that came from, like, I was a grad student for a really long time, which means I made like extremely little money. And I spent a lot of time just like reading finance blogs and stuff. And so when I started a business and wasn't making a lot of money right away, that wasn't too bad. But I always thought like, okay, well, when I have money, I know what to do with it. So I do have short-term and long-term disability. And what I ended up doing after a little bit of research, and everyone should do their own research because it's different depending on where you live, and what might be available now might be different than it was a few years ago. But for long-term disability, I have that through Freelancers Union, which they are located in New York City, but it's not only for New Yorkers. Basically, they offer disability insurance and other kinds of insurance too, where basically on the policy, I think they're listed as your employer, and it doesn't mean they're your employer. It just means that's how an insurance policy has to be set up. Um,
Ah,
yeah. So, but the insurance itself is through Guardian, which is like very legit. That happens to be also the company I use for life insurance. So I know it's just a company, and they're basically a vendor for Guardian, but it's a way to get that at, it's very low cost, really. I mean, $30 or $40 a month. And so long-term disability doesn't necessarily replace your income if something should happen to you, but it would likely pay more than federal benefits would. And it does correspond to your income to a point. It gets capped, but basically it's, I think, 2/3 maybe of your income it's supposed to cover. So of course that's capped. So if you make more than like their maximum, you're still making that top amount. But it's, yeah, affordable. And for me, I mean, being someone who financially contributes to my household in a big way, it just added a little bit of peace of mind for me that, like, really I'm not investing a lot there, but it would help so much if something were to happen and I wasn't able to work long term, you know?
yeah. Yeah, I'm in that camp of when I first heard you talk about it, I was assuming that Social Security disability insurance, and for those of us in the US, that's our federal disability program. Why would a self-employed person need to buy disability insurance if they have paid into Social Security? And I didn't realize until you mentioned it, I still can't believe it, that you need more, that it's not going to be sufficient, most likely, to replace even a majority of your self-employed income. And then that also, like the eligibility requirements, the waiting period, there's a
Hmm.
lot to it. And I didn't realize that you could get even additional riders, supplemental insurance if you wanted to, like to cover things like retirement protection, like replacing the retirement contributions you made while you were working, or a student loan rider, make payments towards
Hmm.
your student loans so that, why you couldn't work, like all these things that SSI is not going to do for you. So I was so grateful when you mentioned it because I was really in the dark about that.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know why anyone would just know that. Like, it's just not like talked about or like readily available. And then in addition to that, I have short-term disability. So that's something that would kick in sooner. I think like 90 days, I don't know, 60, 90 days, something like that. And that I have bundled through my state. So with the New York State Insurance Fund, it's an offering. And by the way, all of this is very US specific. There are people in
Right.
other
Yeah.
countries just like, that sounds like a nightmare.
Laugh that are laughing at us right now. I know it's horrible.
Yes. So that being said, so through New York State, I have short-term disability and paid family leave bundled together. That's how they offer it. So that it's a few $100s a year, but that does cover, and this is stuff that employers will do for you sometimes if you work there as a benefit, but that covers short-term injury and that kind of thing, but also paid family leave, which can be caretaking for a sick family member or giving birth and basically parental leave. So I'm planning on having a child. I have that insurance in place because I want to get at least some parental leave. Again, it's capped. It doesn't totally cover my income, but it would give me like a few months of just like, I can get a check, and get a little bit of income while I'm taking care of a child, or in the event I'm taking care of a family member. That stuff, it helps, right? So it's not going to completely cover as much money as you'd be bringing in if you were sitting at your desk and working, but like it is something. And I think every little bit can help so that we're not draining our savings every time we have to deal with something in
Yeah,
life.
that's so fantastic. It's wonderful to have that care in place for when that time comes. And It's so great that you did that. And I hope that this helps other people too to get that in place. It will help me. I am going to do it. I promise.
Yeah, unfortunately, like, all this stuff does cost money, and that's another reason why we have to, like, charge fair prices for our work, because we're not just taking home an hourly rate and we get to keep it. Like, a lot of that goes to taxes, and then a lot of that goes to our retirement savings and our, insurances and stuff like that, because we're our own employer. So, just something to keep in mind. It's all related to charging what you're worth.
Exactly. Well, what I'd like to do now is wrap up with just some rapid fire questions. First one is, if you had to describe UX consulting in one word, how would you describe it?
Juggling.
Yeah, that's a good one. So true.
Which, let me say, that's what I like about it. I think a lot of us can relate to just having like a ton of interest and being excited by new ideas and new things and switching gears and meeting people. It's just energizing. If it's not, maybe this isn't the career for you.
Right. Yeah, 100%. And that is, I think, so accurate. It is a juggle and a hustle, and you have to be up for it.
You have to enjoy it.
Yeah. And what's the best piece of business advice you've ever received?
I think there's two. One's very tactical, but having a separate bank account for your tax money is very helpful. I would lose track and not do well if I didn't just immediately put, that percent of money into this whole separate account.
Yeah.
Like a high yield savings, whatever you can do to get a little bit of interest on that. Just set that away and don't spend it. But I think also for business advice, it also can be business owner advice. This is something I talk about in therapy, which is keeping perspective on why you're running the business for yourself. What do you actually care about? Like, why are you even doing this? Because it can be easy to get pulled in directions and not really think too much about it and go for more money and this and that. But for me, I run a business because I want to have control and I want flexibility and I want freedom. So when things start going in that direction where I'm not feeling those things and there's tension, like, it's not about the bigger clients and the bigger contracts and the higher revenue for the year. For me, it's just about balancing everything. Remind yourself of what you're doing, right? And check in and readjust as needed.
I love that. And lastly, what consulting resources have been most helpful for you, whether it be books, podcasts, coaches' articles?
I love the book Design is a Job by Mike Montero. So that's been around a while. I mean, the first edition came out more than 10 years ago. So I'm sure a lot of folks have read it. There is an updated version, which I bought the zine version of, I think directly
Me too.
from him online, which I love. I think he just like lays things out in a way that is so no BS and just so like, here's how you write a proposal so that there's no surprises to the client. You've set everything up in a way. Here's how you negotiate. Here's how you remember that companies don't care about you. You have to care about you, like it's, we do this stuff because we love doing it, but we got to pay our bills,
I think he's brilliant. I think Mike Montero, just look up anything that he's written. It's worth reading. Did you get your little bar of soap with your zine too?
Yes.
Yeah.
I did, yeah.
It's on newspaper paper. Yes. I thought that was cute. And everybody can check out Becca's consultancy at Kennason.com. That's Kennason. And I will put a link in the show notes. She has a great newsletter exploring everyday design called Interrobang, which I didn't even know what an interrobang was until reading it. Apparently, it's the exclamation point, question mark together. Is that right? That's called an interrobang,
That's exactly
that punctuation
right.
point. Yeah, I thought that
Yes.
was so cool. I'm like, I didn't know that was a thing. But I love all of your reflections. It shows how you're a great writer, and it just shows your love of just content. And I love your musings about reflection of design. She has a great piece on the Pizza Hut experience in the 90s. And, I mentioned Disney before too. Just really good stuff to read, fun stuff. So please check that out. And Becca, thank you so much again for taking the time out of your day to share your wisdom with us. It was just awesome to catch up with you.
Thank you, Kyle.
All right. Take care. All right. That wraps up this episode. Thanks for joining me. So do you have a topic or a question that you would like us to explore on a future episode of the UX Consultants Lounge? Perhaps there's an anonymous consulting story you want to submit. If so, click on the link in the show notes to submit your story or question from the podcast website. Until next time, keep that consultancy going. I can't wait to have you back at the lounge for our next episode.